Okay, well, welcome to chapter 3 of this course, L3, Popular Culture in Britain since 1945. I'm still going through the general background to this period, and the year I've got up to is 1968. Now, of course, 1968, the centre of interest for people around the world was France, where there was the enormous student revolt and the 10 million workers on strike, and everything, all kinds of change appeared to be possible. General de Gaulle seemed to panic and head off for Germany to see what his generals thought of the situation. So it's a very exciting time from that point of view. And there was some echo in Britain, in particular in the universities, in the London School of Economics in London, and Warwick University and various universities around the place. There was occupations and huge meetings talking about revolutionary politics and how to make the same thing happen as was happening in France. But of course, much weaker than the movement in France, which had really shaken the world up. The other event that I'd like to mention from 1968 in Britain is the famous speech by Enoch Powell, who was high up in the shadow cabinet at the time, and had been touted to be a probable future leader of the Conservative Party. And he made this very well-known speech in Birmingham saying that in the future, the blacks will have the whip hand over the whites, so using an image from slavery, which was particularly offensive, and in general, defending the idea that it was impossible for black and white people to live together in the same society in any numbers, and that because of the numbers of non-white people rising, the future was terrible, bloody conflict, inevitable, terrible, bloody conflict. Now, of course, we've been able to test in practice, and we know this turned out to be completely untrue, but this certainly caused an enormous political row at the time. He was hoping to be able to attract a whole section of conservative supporters around him. He did get a lot of support. He went too far for his own leadership, and the Conservative Party leadership sacked him from his post on the shadow cabinet, but he got a lot of support in the country. In fact, the following day, there were strikes. There were dockers and immigration control workers on strike to support Enoch as a racist strike, extremely rare in British history, a racist strike. We've had more anti-racist strikes, but that was a key moment, and also I think, a key moment in the history of racism and anti-racism in Britain. 1969, I have chosen two episodes here. First of all, in the North Sea, oil was discovered. Not a little bit of oil, millions and millions of barrels of oil. So this appeared to be extremely good news. And the Labour government at the time was determined that a lot of the money would come to the government to be able to build up a better welfare state. But it was also true that to drill for the oil, you needed a tremendous amount of investment. It's very, very expensive. For the first few years, it's extremely expensive before the oil starts coming out. And it seems to have been mostly multinationals, or in particular American oil companies, who made the big money from this. This also had a political side to it because it was the oil was found, of course, off the coast of Scotland, and Scottish nationalism had already been on the rise. The idea of independence for Scotland, from being an absolutely marginal idea, was beginning to get a little bit of minority support. And of course, the arrival of North Sea oil was a way for the nationalists to say, well, everybody says we're too small a country to survive, but in fact, we are rich because of the oil. Now, in fact, the North Sea oil will cost a lot of money to the government in the 70s and make a lot of money for the government in the 80s. So it takes a long time to get oil in and sell it. And so, strangely enough, those governments who took the decisions were not the ones who profited from it politically. This is also the beginning of the what the Northern Irish humorists refer to as the Troubles, which is a low-level civil war with a few hundred people, um, dozens or a couple of hundred people dying every year, from 1969 to 1997 in Northern Ireland. And the one of the key moments for this was in 1969, when in a situation where Catholics in Northern Ireland were being attacked by armed groups of Protestants and being defended by armed groups of Catholics, the British troops were sent into Northern Ireland. Initially, the Catholics welcomed them and said, "Well, you know, at least they will protect us against these terrible attacks." But quite quickly, they became very unpopular among the Catholics, because they were not, in fact, neutral, and they essentially supported a status quo where the Catholic did not have much space to grow. And there you can see the Catholic part of town in the photograph, and the wall slogan, "You are now entering free Derry," meaning this is the part of town where the Protestant police, because almost all the police were Protestant, dare not come in. Now, this was a reflection of a very much segregated society in Northern Ireland, where Catholics were extremely badly treated. And certainly in 1969, if you lived in the Catholic part of town and you had a problem, you certainly would not call the police. You would have to be very, very foolish to call the police. They could well come, take your children away, and you might see them a few days later covered in bruises. It was a completely sectarian police force, and this was one of the causes of the conflict. So, important moment there, 1969, the conflict in Northern Ireland hots up. The following year, we have two general elections in 1970. It was extremely rare in British history, and everybody's surprised to see the Conservatives win. In fact, people had assumed that Harold Wilson, who had been the Prime Minister from 64 till 70, was going to win through, but he didn't. And the Conservatives won by quite a small amount. I think I'm getting confused there. No, it's 1974 when we have two elections, not 1970. In the period of Heath's government, one of the big conflicts is with trade unions and the introduction of the Industrial Relations Act. At this moment, it's there referred to as a bill because it's not yet been passed into law. And the Industrial Relations Bill, which was to become the Industrial Relations Act. I could go into details, but really it was to make life much harder for trade unions, to give them less right to organize and protest. And the response was a very large campaign by trade unions, so much so that the act eventually was not used very much, and then the following government abolished it. You will see there at the bottom left a graph of trade union density. That is, what is the percentage of trade union of workers who were in trade unions, and you can see a tremendous rise during the First World War, and a tremendous rise also during the Second World War, a high level in the 50s, 60s, a rise again in the 70s, and then a decline which takes us right back to the situation in 1930, and it's stable. I can't remember the exact numbers today, but it's stabilized out around this level. 1971 is also the first time that on television you could see the programs of the Open University. The Open University, a new kind of university to help people, in particularly housewives who had not had the chance to go to university, to take a degree at home. And Harold Wilson once said that this was the political action he was most proud of that he'd done in all his years in office, and certainly gained a tremendous reputation around the world. The period of the Heath government is a period of tremendous conflict, here I have in 1972 two examples. First of all, 1972, the Saltley Gate Coke Works. To simplify the story a little bit, the coal miners were on strike, and they'd managed to stop most of the factories which transformed coal into more useful coke. But one big factory was still working, Saltley Gate. And it turned out that the situation was that if the miners could stop this factory, they would win the strike. And if they could not stop this factory, they would lose the strike. So it was the key moment. And this is a time when people were, the miners was the strongest trade unions, but there were other strong trade unions around. And famously, Arthur Scargill, the leader of the Yorkshire miners, went around the factories in Birmingham and said, you know that if your factory was on strike, the miners would support you. I demand that you come and support us. And very large, many thousands of workers came out of their factories, went to the Saltley Gate Coke Works and closed it down. And in the government, they were discussing, should we send the army? There had never been, there hadn't been for a long time armed conflict around strikes in Britain. They decided not to send the army. The miners won the strike, and this was the highest point, one of the highest points, the early 1970s, of trade union power in Britain, and the moment where I think a whole section of the Conservative Party leadership decided our first priority has to be to radically reduce the power of trade unions, and they will succeed in doing this, but it will take them 15 years. The other tremendous conflict in 1972 is Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland. Be careful, there are a number of events in the history of Britain which have been entitled Bloody Sunday. This is Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, where there was a demonstration for equal rights for Catholics, and the British Army attacked the demonstration and killed a certain number of people. I can't remember if it's 10 or 12. It's something around those numbers. Now, this is a tremendously significant moment. In the newspapers, they said the soldiers had to fight, had to shoot in self-defense, and that they weren't the first people to shoot. And in the House of Commons, they voted to agree with this, and the House of Lords, they voted to agree with this. And so that was how it went down. And this had two effects. So the immediate effect was that there had been a division in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, among those people who wanted to see Ireland reunited with the south of Ireland. Had been, before 1972, there were two opinions. There were those who said, well, the solution is political, we need to demonstrate, we need to petition, we need to stand for Parliament and so on. And there was others saying, no, it's a military problem. We need an army, we need the IRA to fight against the British Army. And people were divided. But in 1972, these young men were shot dead by the army in front of their own homes. They were in front of these huge council tower blocks, and hundreds of people saw it from all the windows. Hundreds of people saw it happen. They were shot. And so this political situation completely changed. The easiest job in the world in 1972 was recruitment officer for the IRA. Because the debate which previously had gone on between the two wings of republicanism now went, one group says, well, the solution is to have demonstrations and to have petitions. And the IRA supporters said, you had a demonstration. They shot your children in front of your house. How stupid are you? And so this gave a tremendous boost to the military option within Northern Ireland. And this will, throughout the 70s, become more and more a violent conflict between the British Army and the IRA and the loyalist armed groups, of which, unsurprisingly, some pretty horrible things were done by all sides. To move on to 1974, we had a situation where there is once more a miners' strike, and the government, the Heath government, is trying to get support from the public against the strikers, and they decide to, at this time, coal is extremely important in the British economy, and most of the electricity comes from coal, which is no longer the case today. And so, because there was not enough electricity, the government decided to have a 3-day week. People are only allowed to go to work for 3 days, not for 5 days. And so this will save electricity. And the government hoped that in this situation, the population, in particular the electorate, would say, oh, they would get angry against the miners. In the short term, they probably did, but as the weeks went by, people began to get angry towards the government. And when Edward Heath called an election, and his slogan was, "Who rules the country?" The answer of the electorate was, "It's not you." The Conservatives lost the election in February, and a minority Labour government became the government then under Harold Wilson. And in October, they had a second election and they got a small majority. One of the laws that they passed during 1974 as a way to try to gain support, for the next election, but also, which was part of that program, was the Health and Safety at Work Act. And even today, if you go onto building site, you will see this sign, Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, and this made for much stricter rules about safety on building sites, in factories, in workshops, and elsewhere. And the number of people dying from accidents at work went down very, very significantly over these times. I think people forget how cheap life used to be in the workplace. So we now have a Labour government from 1974 to 79 for 5 years, first of all under Wilson, and then under James Callaghan. I'll talk about him in a moment. And there are, in 1975, I've chosen two events. First of all, the new head of the Conservative Party, elected leader of the Conservative Party, February 1975, then Margaret Thatcher. And as you know, 4 years later, she will become Prime Minister. So the first female leader of a major party, although rather a special attitude to women and men in politics, because when she is Prime Minister, among her ministers, there will be fewer women than there had been for some time. And she didn't surround herself with other women. And she represents a move to the right of the Conservative Party, a more strict, more anti-union, more anti-nationalisation, more in favour of neoliberalism. I'll talk a little more about her in a moment. This was also the year of the first referendum about staying in the EEC, the European Economic Community, which will later become the European Union. The reason for the referendum is that the Labour Party was completely divided. Some of them said, oh, yes, it's good to be in the European Union. At this time, I think there were only 6 or 9 members of the European Union, a very small number. It's good to be in because it helps trade and so on. And other people in the Labour Party saying, well, no, it's a rich countries club. It excludes Africa, and it excludes in particular our ex-colonies. And it's very much a neoliberal institution, and it's not really compatible with socialist politics. So you have this division within the Labour Party, and the solution to keep the party united, because there could have been a split, was that Harold Wilson decided we will have a referendum. That is, the people will decide, and then those he was confident that the people would decide in favour of the European Economic Community, and then the people who were against it would keep quiet, because once the people have decided, those who lost the argument, well, they would normally accept it. Then this worked very well for Harold Wilson. The electorate decided in 1975 to stay inside the European Economic Community, and so it was a successful thing. Now I think you can remember that some years later, it was a similar exercise, but less successful. James Callaghan is in 1976 becomes the new prime minister after Wilson resigns. And here are four of the important moments of his prime ministership. First of all, the actual arrival of North Sea oil, because it's one thing to discover it and it's another thing for it to come in. Now, of course, the arrival of North Sea oil is it's quite a lot of money. It was an important event for them. There was nevertheless a crisis in 1976, partly because a lot of big businessmen put their money abroad because they didn't like the left-wing, the occasional left-wing decisions of the Labour government, and the Labour government decided to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund. But the International Monetary Fund said, we will lend you the money if you cut education and you cut health in this way and this way. So this was a big crisis, and because of the cuts in social budgets, the Labour Party lost some of its support among the population. They also brought in the Race Relations Act in 1976, which was a very mild act, a very, very small set of rules. It meant that after 1976, if you were black and you went into a shop and the shopkeeper said, I'm not selling you anything, you're black. Now, notice that before 1976, there was nothing the black person could do. It was not illegal. But after 1976, they have in this situation the right to go to find a lawyer and go take them to the tribunal and sue them. That is to say, it became a civil offence, not a criminal offence, but a civil offence to discriminate in certain circumstances. So this law strengthened the law from 1965. It went a little bit further, and finally, the key moment of 1978, which was has become known as the Winter of Discontent, which is based on a misquote from Shakespeare, but that's not really so important. And this was a series of public sector strikes. Where, although it was a Labour government and in general trade unions felt that the Labour Party was our government, nevertheless, at this time they were on strike. And this probably helped the Conservatives to win the election of 1979, but I'll come to that in a moment. 1977 is a symbolic year for 2 years, for two reasons. First of all, it is the Silver Jubilee, that it's 25 years since the Queen Elizabeth became Queen, and of course 24 years since the coronation. They don't have a coronation immediately. The old king dies. And so in 1977, you have the Silver Jubilee of the Queen, and they build, they name the new underground line, which they open in this year, the Jubilee Line. And you can see here a party to celebrate this. I think this party is probably in Northern Ireland. But there were parties around the place. There were parties around, street parties across Britain, and a lot of people were celebrating the Silver Jubilee. I remember we got a free mug or something from school, Silver Jubilee marked on it. Now, this is interesting because, as you know, the British are not great street partying people. But of course, it was contradictory too, because at the same time, the Sex Pistols released their famous song, God Save the Queen, which launched or popularized punk rock, and punk rock brought in something very new. Punk rock brought sarcasm into popular music, which was something very, very new at the time. And so the wonderful words of the song, God Save the Queen, we mean it, man, we love our Queen. And with the sarcastic voice to go with. So both of these things were going on at the same time, as well as this political campaign, which you can see with the badge here, Stuff the Jubilee, Fight the Cuts. And so this is a very good example of how when you try to identify the zeitgeist, what do people in France or in Britain think? You know, what is the spirit of the times? And I very often come up with, I think the word you're looking for is contradictory, because contradictory attitudes and opinions are what is normal in history. It's not surprising that it's contradictory. It's normal. 2 years later, partly due to some popular anger about public service strikes, and partly due to a tremendously expensive Conservative campaign, Margaret Thatcher won the election of 1979, and for 18 years, Britain will have a Conservative government, for 11 years under Margaret Thatcher, and then 7 years under her successor, John Major. So a tremendously long time, and this will be a time which is sometimes referred to as the neoliberal revolution. Now, revolution may be overstating the case, but certainly this is a time of very big changes. Large numbers of nationalized industries are privatized. The power of trade unions is very significantly weakened. The level of money available for unemployed people is very much reduced, and pensions similarly. The ideas of Thatcherism are the idea that the best way to organize any human activity is the market, that private companies are superior in every way to public companies. So that means, firstly, they wanted to privatize as many industries as they could, and those things which they cannot privatize, education, health, they liked to organize in a way that it nevertheless imitated the private sector. So within education, they like to emphasize competition between different schools. How can we organize competition between different schools so that the parents choose which one they like best? Now, of course, this is very much criticized by people who do not agree with Thatcherism, who tend to underline that when you have parental choice, in fact, middle-class parents get to choose and working-class parents just get whatever is left. So here is one example of the activities of the Conservative government, the privatization of British Gas. And this is interesting because the Conservative government then declared that nationalisation is a bad way to organise an industry and a private industry would be better. On the other hand, they could not say, okay, so we're selling British Gas to McDonald's, or we're selling British Gas to Shell, some enormous, huge multinational. They couldn't do that because that looked like, it just looked like you were selling something that belonged to everybody to a small group of millionaires. And so they had a brilliant idea from their point of view, and that is that they sold some of the companies, for example, British Gas, but there was a limit on how many shares you could have. So they sold British Gas to, well, tens of thousands of people across Britain. You were only allowed to buy, I don't know, 10 shares or something, so, you know, a couple of £100. And so they could present this as, we are taking British Gas, which was an enormous bureaucratic centralized industry, and we are giving it to the people. That was the political way of presenting it. Whereas, of course, if they just sold it to an enormous millionaire, that would not have looked so good politically. Now, critics would say that the result was similar because many, many people bought shares in British Gas, £100, £200, £300, and then the following year sold it to the millionaires because it was now worth double. And so they made some short-term money, but in the long term, it was big shareholders that won out. I'm giving you the example of British Gas. There were several more. The idea of this is both to privatize British Gas and British Aerospace, British Telecom, but also to spread in society the idea that private is better. It's an ideological, it's a political campaign, which is hugely important. And this will continue over the next 30 years. And so, for example, as you probably know, if you go to university in Britain, you have to pay £12,000 a year. Then this is not really frais d'inscription, this is tuition fees, that is, it's the cost of the teachers. And the reason that this was possible, of course, they had to do it little by little, or it wouldn't have been possible. But the reason it was possible is that the argument was, if you go to university, you will get a better salary. So you're going to university for you, so you should pay. This is neoliberalism. This is methodological individualism. This is Thatcherism. Although, in fact, many of these reforms were continued by Tony Blair, and certainly the tuition fees were more a feature of Blairism. The weakening of trade unions was certainly a major priority of Margaret Thatcher, and you can see that she passed new laws about trade union activity in 1980, in 1982, 1984, 1988, and 1993. This is very, very interesting because it shows that she was not too confident. She could have passed one big law taking the power of trade unions away. That was not possible. There would have been a social explosion. And so every 2 years, a new law taking away a little more of the power, and watching very carefully what was the political response. Was it possible to get people in the country to support this limitation of trade union power? Was it possible to get the trade unions to not be happy, but to accept it without organizing a social explosion? So very much a war of position, yeah, not a war of what's the other kind of war, which is not a war of position? I can't remember anymore. It's a huge war where you all go into a big fight. Well, the war of position is where you take little by little positions. And the result of all this was that many things which trade unions do, for example, solidarity strikes, for example, having a closed shop, on appelle ça le monopole syndical à l'embauche, these were made difficult or illegal over these 10 years, and this made a tremendous difference. And certainly the trade unions were much weaker over this period. Another last one for today, I think, is to go back to the theme of Northern Ireland. The conflict was continuing in Northern Ireland, and in 1981 there was the hunger strike, which became very well known. In fact, this was a conflict between Republican prisoners and the prison system. For a long time, Republican prisoners had been treated a little bit like political prisoners, so they were allowed to receive newspapers. They did not have to wear prison uniforms, etc. They were treated differently. And the new idea, begun by the Labour government, but continued by the Conservative Party, was the criminalisation of Republican prisoners. They're saying that, well, they're just criminals. And this led to a long campaign. For example, the prison authorities said, you must wear prison uniform. And the Republicans said, we can't wear prison uniform. We're not criminals. We're political prisoners. We're not criminals. We refuse to wear it. And the authorities said, well, we won't give you any clothes there. And so for years, the Republican prisoners had just a blanket. And then the prison authorities said, you can't go to the toilet if you won't put your uniform on. And so they were not allowed to go to the toilet for years, and they had to just live in absolutely very disgustingly dirty conditions. And the final round was the hunger strike, where a group of Republican prisoners decided to go on hunger strike, with the aim of winning these demands: no prison uniform, we are not criminals, we are political prisoners. Margaret Thatcher's position was, nobody supports them, they're just criminals. And so the hunger strike went on, and a number of people died. I can't remember if it's 10 or 12. And they didn't get their demands. So it appeared to be a defeat for the Republican prisoners. In fact, it was not. It was a political victory. And the reason was that one of the elements of this is that when the first Republican hunger striker, Bobby Sands, was dying, by pure accident, there was a by-election in Northern Ireland, and Bobby Sands presented himself and was elected Member of Parliament. And so you got this situation where Margaret Thatcher was saying, nobody supports them, they're just criminals. And the Republicans could answer, this gentleman has just been elected Member of Parliament. And of course, front page of every newspaper, every big newspaper in the world, Member of Parliament dies on hunger strike. So it was politically very much a defeat. for Margaret Thatcher, although although the hunger strikers died. That's about enough for a half an hour chapter. There will be more because I will be continuing with the background and then theory of popular culture, visual arts, popular music, and we'll see how many other things we can think up. Thank you very much for listening. That's all for now. I just have to find the place where I click to say that it's all over. Arrêtez le partage d'abord. Fin de la réunion. Bye bye.